This is the foundings and prelude to the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, presented by me, Nolan Sverdrup. So, one of the most important things in our daily lives as people is the environment. It surrounds us everywhere, from rivers, streams, trees, grass, bugs, everywhere around us. There is nature. And this nature is very important for us to protect and to try and build upon. But throughout history, we have not been so great about that as a society. We have ended up many times putting nature in danger. And this danger comes a lot through pollution. Pollution through crop dusting, through throwing trash carelessly around, ending up in lakes, rivers, streams, landfills that get too large. We transport oil around, and that oil gets into the ocean sometimes and causes dangers to the plants and animals. And so, in order to try and stop all of this pollution, or to assist in the mitigation of it, the EPA was founded. So, what was really happening before then? How did things get so bad that we needed an environmental protection agency? Well, it all kind of goes back to the 1760 to 1840, when the Industrial Revolution was happening. During this time, as you could probably guess, industries were booming. A lot of companies were being started up. A lot of people were moving into America to work and try and make it big. And with this, a lot of things came with the increase in industrialization. One of these things was factories that produce a lot of pollutions. They release a lot of gases into the atmosphere that sort of float around, get into places that we don't want them to be, and cause problems. These gases, such as sulfur dioxide, promethium, hydrocarbons, carbon dioxide, and nitric oxide, all get into the atmosphere. And some of these, carbon dioxide in particular, might not sound too bad, but when these factories are producing it, it comes out a lot more than it does when humans produce it. So it becomes a problem that goes into the atmosphere, traps sunlight, and creates this greenhouse effect that continues happening. And so, because there's a lot of people moving to America as well that are trying to work in factories, cities grew tremendously. Population sizes went up a lot. Streets were getting more populated, areas needed houses to be built, and a lot of the times there wasn't enough living space for everyone to have their own home, and a lot of people had to stay on the streets, group together in houses, and it just became such a big problem for the time. So streets would just get flooded with people, populations on like a high, and what that caused was a lot of trash was being produced for all these people. Everyone was just throwing their trash where they could find, because if a trash can was full, well, there's nowhere else to put it, so just throw it onto the side of the streets. And with not a lot of places to throw this trash, landfills were being filled up with the new population sizes. It ended up accumulating in rivers and in the forests, just anywhere that it could go. Also, this increased the amount of transportation that needed, whether it be public transportation as buses, whether it be transportation of people through cars, as shown here, or even transportation of materials, as businesses needed more materials to be shipped around. They didn't just produce them in their factories necessarily. They needed to take in inputs, and then they'd ship out their outputs too. And a lot of this also needed fuel, and so they would have to import oil, coal, whatever. It would need to get shipped around as well. And so more smog is being produced through these factories that are shipping in inputs that are then producing outputs that need to go somewhere else. The transportation is creating fumes as well. And the oil being shipped around had major spills that happened. It was leaking. There weren't like safety regulations going on at the time. And all of this ended up in the ocean, where animals got harmed. Fishing industries would be harmed as a result. People were losing food supplies. And it just kept on kind of going on, and no one really stopped it. Another thing that was happening too was runoff. And runoff was such a big deal that nobody really knew about at the time, where farmers were crop dusting their fields, rain would come in, wash it all off, and go into the streams, and then it would pollute the rivers and eventually go out into lakes, into oceans, and it just keep going. And there's so many ways that runoff happens, whether it be through construction sites, whether it be through rain gutters in houses going into the streets, sewers being dumped into the ocean. It just keeps on going, and nobody knew anything at the time that was happening and didn't really see it as a problem because it wasn't like an immediate effect that was happening. It just kept on going. So farms would throw pesticides over their crops to protect their fields. Pesticide would run off into rivers that were generally nearby farms, and those rivers would lead to some other water source, which ends up back into the ocean and kills more animals, life, plants, whatever it does. And now, the next event that happened in this series was World War II was going on at the time. And you may think that doesn't really have anything to do with this, but it did. Because September 2nd, 1945, the war was over. And all the soldiers who were out came home. And with that, more population increase, more needs for housing, more needs for resources, lots of things. And so this includes more dumping of trash again, as it was getting filtered out and just thrown into the ocean, lakes, rivers, water, and back we are again at a dead fish. Things are no longer good, and people start thinking, hey, maybe we should do something. Like, oil's being spilled into the ocean, trash is being dumped everywhere, ecosystems are being destroyed, and rivers are even catching on fire. And yes, oil that got spilled into rivers would often create fires, and this would be another big problem among the many others that existed at the time. And so people then realize that we need to take action. And so a man named John Muir earlier had started this idea of ecology, that aesthetics and things that are pleasing to the eye are sometimes more important than efficiency and profits in business. And so this idea of ecology starts catching on with people, that nature can be more important than our businesses and trying to make it rich, and that ignoring nature isn't the right way to go about things. So at this point, plants start tipping the scale and weighing down more on people's minds than trying to start up a business or make it big. It's become a more important thing now for people. And so one of the ways that people started arguing or trying to show that nature was being neglected, that nature is important and beautiful, was through literature. So books like Walden, or Life in the Woods, Moby Dick, and Silent Spring were all written and are great books that really do show how beautiful nature really can be to people. And so people started protesting. They wanted action. They wanted things to happen. They wanted this negligence of nature to stop. And so it did. even people like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson got involved and were advocates for protecting nature. And so some of the first acts that got passed for this were the Soil Conservation Service, which was created in 1938 and eventually turned into the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which works to protect the nature and the soil upon which we build. So we don't just expand out and destroy all of like forests and woodlands, plains, just so we can live there, but to preserve the nature of these areas. Another one was the Pittman-Robertson's Act, which became the Wildlife and Sports Fish Restoration Act as well, which puts a taxes on firearms and ammunitions used for hunting, and would use that then to put money into the research and restoration of wildlife. But that wasn't enough. Businesses were still polluting the air, gases were still being released, it was still a problem that was happening, and nothing at the time was really dealing with it. Which brings us to this man right here, Richard Nixon. He was the current acting president at the time, and had a lot of pressure on him to act, to do something about the environment. And so he did. He started with the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which did a lot of things. It started trying to put restrictions on businesses for air quality. It started doing a little bit of research into materials. But the most important thing that it did was create environmental impact statements that businesses needed to do, where basically they would take their proposed project, research everything that it would do to impact the environment. So if they needed to clear an area, they would have to state that. If they needed to dump waste, where were they going to dump it? How was it going to affect rivers, ecosystems, whatever? What was it going to do? And this was a great step towards protecting the environment. But Nixon wanted more. And so he approached Congress with a list of 37 points. Big ones among those were he wanted $4 billion to go to funding for water treatment plants. He wanted national air quality standards to be set. He wanted federal funding for research on pollution. And through this, he had proposed the creation of a group called the EPA. And so, after some time, eventually the EPA got founded and was created. However, the EPA still had work to do, and a lot at that it needed to get through. So, first actions that the EPA took, they set up a lot of regulations on businesses and rules for what they could do. It set up regulations on how much pollution they could produce, how much outputs that their products could produce, such as like cars, would need to be regulated. So they could only produce a certain amount of smoke or smog into the atmosphere. And with all these regulations, things had started to tone down a little bit. And the EPA had a little bit more time to put resources into other projects. And so their next business was researching, whether it be physical systems or biological systems of plants, ecosystems, animals. They just did research on how to prevent pollution and how to save these already damaged and declining systems. And what they did with all this research is they would go to other smaller groups that were trying to stop pollution in some way, and would share their research with them so that they could better stop these problems from happening, and would end up then collaborating with a bunch of groups and hopefully together they could stop a lot of these problems from happening. And with that, nature was no longer in as much danger as it was before. And the EPA would continue to move along doing research, setting regulations, and continuing forth from there. Thank you for listening to my presentation.